over all of Potiphar's possessions and household, everything except his wife. When Potiphar's wife tried to seduce Joseph, Joseph did the right thing and refused to act against the kindness and trust of Potiphar and sin against God. In spite of the attempt to do what was right, he was unfairly charged and wound up in prison. Even in the unfairness of being put in prison, God was still with Joseph, causing him to prosper to the extent that he was placed in charge of everything. And everything was the other prisoners. Even though God caused Joseph to prosper, he remained in bondage as a prisoner. And as a prisoner, Joseph used every opportunity to make his situation better by exemplifying his faith in God. When God's people find themselves prisoners in the hardships of their lives, they should also use every opportunity to demonstrate their faith, regardless of how difficult and how desperate the situation may be. So the lesson tonight will take a look at the opportunities Joseph took while he faced the hardships of being a prisoner. And then from opportunities Joseph took, we will find that these opportunities come with expectation. So our lesson tonight comes from Genesis 40, 1 through 23, and let's read the chapter. Then it came about after these things, the cupbearer and the baker for the king of Egypt offended their lord, the king of Egypt. Pharaoh was furious with his two officials, the chief cupbearer and the baker. So he put them in confinement in the house of the captain of the bodyguard in the jail, the same place where Joseph was imprisoned. The captain of the bodyguard put Joseph in charge of them, and he took care of them, and they were in confinement for some time. Then the cupbearer and the baker for the king of Egypt, who was confined in jail, both had a dream, the same night, each man with its own dream, and each dream with its own interpretation. When Joseph came to them in the morning and observed them, behold, they were dejected. He asked Pharaoh's officials who were with him in confinement in his master's house, "Why are your faces so sad today?" Then they said to him, "We have had a dream, and there is no one to interpret it." Then Joseph said to them, "Do not interpretations belong to God? Tell it to me, please." So the chief cupbearer told his dream to Joseph, and he said to him, "In my dream, behold, there was a vine in front of me, and on the vine there were 3 branches. And as it was budding, its blossoms came out, and its clusters produced ripe grapes. Now Pharaoh's cup was in my hand, so I took the grapes and squeezed them into Pharaoh's cup, and I put the cup into Pharaoh's hand." And Joseph said to him, "This is the interpretation of it. The 3 branches are 3 days. Within 3 more days, Pharaoh will lift up your head and restore you to your office. And you will put Pharaoh's cup into his hand according to your former custom when you were his cupbearer. Only keep me in mind when it all goes well for you, and please do me a kindness by mentioning me to Pharaoh and get me out of this house. For I was in fact kidnapped from the land of the Hebrews, and even here I have done nothing that they should have put me into the dungeon." When the chief baker saw that he had interpreted favorably, he said to Joseph, I also saw in my dream, and behold, there were 3 baskets of white bread on my head, and in the top basket there were some of all sorts of baked food for Pharaoh, and the birds were eating them out of the basket on my head. Then Joseph answered and said, This is its interpretation. 3 baskets are 3 days. Within 3 more days, Pharaoh will lift up your head from you and will hang you on a tree, and the birds will eat your flesh off of you." Thus it came about on the 3rd day, which was Pharaoh's birthday, that he had made a feast for all its servants, and he lifted up the head of the chief cupbearer and the head of the chief baker among his servants. Turn the page. He restored the chief cupbearer to his office, and he put the cup into Pharaoh's hand, and he hanged the chief baker just as Joseph had interpreted to them. Yet the chief cupbearer did not remember Joseph, but forgot him. Here we have Joseph in prison, and things are going from bad to worse. Taken on face value, the situation Joseph found himself in would be hardship ahead of him. The justified mindset of one being unfairly treated would be one with the absolute right to blame others for the problems he faced. But Joseph isn't a mere man or mortal man. He is someone who is chosen by God to live out a life as an example that we can learn from even today. Being God's instrument, Joseph sets a course that navigates through the hardships he faced in life to achieve God's purpose in him, and him being an instrument of God. That's it. 10 points for you. Very good, very good. I'll clean it up a little bit, but that was very good. You're right on point. The difference is that Joseph acknowledged his will, or acknowledged God's will in him each day, whether it was the hardship or comfort, life or death. Joseph maintained his faith in God. We see this throughout the whole Bible. People being recognized by God for his purposes. Couple examples. God chose Noah, Abraham, Moses, and eventually Mary. And then after praying to God all night, Jesus chose his apostles. Despite the various hardships these people and God's use of Joseph during a tough time in his life serves as an example to us today. Having put on the robes of Christ, dying to him in baptism, risen God to become not just when things are good for us, but when we are faced with the ugly unfairness of life the world presents to us. As instruments of God's will, we should, just as Joseph did, as well as all the others, recognize that God has a plan and a purpose for us. As instruments of God's will, we should, I already said that, sorry. To be chosen, the chosen come with a responsibility. First, to trust and accept God's will by faith. Seek opportunities to glorify God even in hardships. And understand that these opportunities come with expectations. The lesson from Genesis 40 is one of opportunities in life that come. Opportunities that don't necessarily come when times are good. And then they sometimes come from unexpected sources. Sometimes opportunities come when times are tough for us, just as they did for Joseph. By faith, we accept that God makes use of all time, all circumstances that we find ourselves in. There's not a wasted moment in our lives where God doesn't work in our lives. Considering the hardships Jesus faced, one might wonder why God allowed his son to include such an evil man as Judas as an apostle. It's mind-boggling, isn't it? One might also wonder why God allowed a good man like Peter to deny Christ 3 times. God used an evil man and a good man, not for the human purpose of these men, but for his purpose to put into motion Christ's death on the cross for the ultimate sin sacrifice. After realizing what they had done, both men were faced with a difficult position, and in this position they were not without opportunity provided by God. In Judas's case, God's opportunity was not acknowledged nor taken. The only opportunity Judas saw was the one created by himself, and that was suicide. But in Peter's case, he acknowledged God's opportunity, and he took advantage of it by asking Jesus for forgiveness. When we look at Joseph, God provided him an opportunity given by a familiar person, but unexpected altogether. Potiphar was the captain of the guard and in control of the king's prison. When forced by his wife to imprison Joseph, Potiphar placed him in the prison he controlled. The prison wasn't just the usual prison for common criminals. It was a special prison for special people. God used the false testimony of an evil person to place Joseph where he wanted him to be. Not a place Joseph wanted to be in, but a place that would eventually allow him to serve God's purpose. Once in jail, Joseph doesn't wallow in despair about how unfair his life is. Working for Potiphar, Joseph understood that he was a slave and he had no standing with his master. He was dependent on his master's mercy. Now that he is a prisoner, Joseph finds himself in a position where he is much lower than a mere slave. Just as we are enslaved in our sins and often find ourselves in low places in life, places we don't want to be, and just like Joseph, we have no standing with God and only can rely on God's mercy. Joseph acknowledges the opportunity God has given him, which is to be an instrument of his will. We too can be instruments of God's will when presented with God's opportunities, even when our position is one of hardship. It didn't take Joseph very long to make an impression. Being under Potiphar's command, the jailer comes to see Joseph differently than the other prisoners. The benefit being that he would be placed in the role of authority over all the other prisoners. The opportunity coming from an unlikely source, which was the man who put him in prison. In the Genesis account, Joseph received help and support from Potiphar despite the accusations brought against him. Placing Joseph in a tougher and unfamiliar position, Potiphar used Joseph for the good of his will, and that was to maintain order in the prison. In our case, God allows his children to encounter tough and unfair conditions, not so they can be in misery, but be an instrument of his goodwill. Sometimes opportunities come from chances to serve. Losing his relative freedom as the head slave in Potiphar's household and to be thrown into prison for something he didn't do, Joseph could have been resentful. He could have focused his resentfulness on God, and Mark talked about this last weekend, how sometimes we take bad times and blame God for it. He could have asked God why he was allowed these circumstances to fall on his faithful servant. Joseph could have also blamed God for what he didn't know. So how often do we rush to judgment without all the information? We do that, don't we? Yeah. Joseph could have wallowed in his misery. He could have continued to blame his brothers for the way they treated him. He could have spent time blaming his father for not coming and finding him, rescuing him from all this unfairness. He could have added blaming Potiphar's wife for falsely accusing him, and then blame Potiphar a man who he faithfully served for putting him unjustly in prison. And he could also blame God. But Joseph didn't do any of this. In his misery, he focused on what he had and not what he didn't have. And what he had was a chance, an opportunity to serve others. When we are treated unfairly, what is our usual response? Do we tend to look past the unfairness of it all and look for opportunities to serve others? Do we tend to do that? How good are we at that? Not very good at times. In chapter 40 of Genesis, what's the opportunities of service given to Joseph by God? That's the question. I didn't read it very well. What's the opportunity? He woke up one morning and saw what? The two people that were with him were dejected. He noticed two fellow prisoners who were upset. So what did Joseph do with his opportunity? What did he do with it? He used it. He put aside his self-pity and tried to comfort the men. He put the needs of these men before his needs. Life in prison isn't the best for any of the prisoners, including Joseph. In his actions, he didn't have to add to the hardship of others just because he was unfairly put in jail. We all face hard times in our lives, sometimes forgetting that others might be facing hardships as well. The worst thing we could do is add to their burden with our burdens. The opportunity God gives us in our life struggles may be as simple as not making the hardships of others any more than they have to be. So, how do we survive the hard times we face? We start by gaining more knowledge. The more knowledge we have, the better understanding of the situation that we see. The next thing is we focus on the opportunity to serve. And the third is to strive in our lives for what is better and not what it's worth. In prison, Joseph gives a great example of being in control of the hardships he found himself in. Being in control, he saw the opportunities to serve the need of others. He focused on others and not himself. And in doing so, he stepped outside his misery and became a purposeful person. We too can be more purposeful in our lives when we step outside our misery and focus on how to help people around us. And when I thought about that, T. Middlebrook came to my mind. If y'all remember him, that guy was incredible. But on the joy he could bring to other people. He's a great example for us to live by. Finding opportunities in times of hardships come from a focus on God. When the two men told Joseph their problems, they were beyond his comprehension. In order to help them, Joseph called on God. He focused on the only one who could help him. Isn't it a prideful thing when your children, faced with a problem, immediately turn to you for help? Isn't it? It doesn't make you feel good, CJ, when your daughters come to you first? Why? Why is that? I know, but when they do, why is it? Because they trust you, right? We hope that when our children have problems, their focus immediately turns to their parents. That's the ideal for all parenting. And this is what Joseph did. He faced a problem, and his focus immediately turned to his heavenly Father. To the two men in prison with Joseph, dreams were considered messages from deity about life and the future. Dreams made pagan people nervous. They believed their God used dreams to warn them of future events or situations. Since the dreams of these two men involved complex symbolism and had its own interpretation, the dreamers were confused by the meaning. In the ancient Near East, an entire discipline of interpreting dreams existed. Kings usually had among their advisors a variety of learned specialists, magicians, and sorcerers who would be on hand to interpret mysterious dreams. We find an example of this in Daniel chapter 2 and verse 2. Since these officials of Pharaoh were now prisoners, they were helpless to receive the insight into the meanings of their dreams. They couldn't seek out these people. Hearing these men's dreams, Joseph offered his help. Help, he told him, would come from God. So Joseph goes to God for the answer to the dreams. And how quickly does God respond to Joseph's needs?